Welcome everyone, thanks for coming along this afternoon. The session today is Conspiracy Theories, Authoritarianism and the Far Right with speakers Julie Sherry and Mark Thomas. My name is Hannah and I'm a member of the Socialist Workers Party in the Glasgow branch, and I'll be chairing the meeting today. If you joined any of the sessions yesterday, you'll be aware that we are kickstarting each meeting with a short video of music, poetry or readings as part of Marxism in Scotland's online virtual cultural tent. The videos are a reminder of the power of the arts to usurp and protest, which I think is a particularly important theme for today's meeting. So today we're lucky to have the Glasgow-based anti-fascist punk band, the Kidney Flowers. Guitarist Grant Canyon and drummer Abby Calder have been performing for a number of years and are heavily involved in Love Music, Hate Racism. The Kidney Flowers write music to agitate people into action, and they passionately believe in music being something that can bring people together in the fight for a better world. So we'll now play the video by the Kidney Flowers. It's their new track, Mutiny. Take a couple of minutes to load, or seconds, sorry.
Hi, I'm Grant.
I'm Abby. We are the Kidney Flowers.
That's correct. We hope you're enjoying Marxism in Scotland 2020, the online edition. You're about to hear a song from us that's about the dangers of indoctrination and why you should fight against it. Solidarity. Hope you're having a nice time.
Bye.
Bye-bye. He says bye too.
Hi, I'm Grant. This is Abby. We're the Kidney Flowers. And we recorded this song just for you. It goes a little something like this.
Seen a wish you, smiling while they frisk you, standing in a straight line, being around your waistline. In the name of, it's all in the name of, fighting for a statue, fighter they attack you. I don't trust the youth, I don't believe the truth. I don't read the news, and I wish you refuse. Walking uphill when you don't give up still, sleeping with the lights on, fucking with your tights on. And it's all great, listen to them all say, this is for your freedom, you may only seize them. I don't trust the proof, I don't believe the youth, and I'm the odd one out, I'm the one you read about. Don't believe the hype, question all the time.
Bye.
That was great. What a way to kickstart the meeting today. So the Kidney Flowers are featured on an album released by the Glasgow Love Music, Hate Racism. It's a digital and a vinyl release, and it's going to be available from the 1st of December. It's been a challenging year to organise anti-racist music events. So please go to the Love Music, Hate Racism Glasgow Facebook page. You don't have to be on Facebook to look at it and to find out more about the release. Before I hand over to the speakers, and this is particularly important for those of you who are unable to attend any sessions yesterday, we have two speakers who will speak for approximately 12 to 15 minutes each. We'll then open the meeting up for discussion and questions and comments before I'll invite the speakers back to summarise. The meeting is being recorded, but it's only those contributing to the discussion, so don't worry about having your camera on or you're able to see at the top of the screen. It's not being filmed if you're not speaking. I'll remind participants or speakers how to contribute to the discussion after we've heard from our two main speakers. So moving on, our first speaker today is Mark Thomas. Mark is on the Central Committee of the Socialist Workers Party and a writer on contemporary European fascism. A link to a recent article by Mark is going to be put in the chat. It's in the International Socialist Journal on the themes of fascism in Europe today. So make sure to look at that. You can read it online. So handing over to Mark.
Thanks, Hannah, and welcome, comrades. I've done a lot of meetings on Zoom this year. I think that was the best start to any, in fact, that's possibly the best start to any meeting I've done in the last 25 years. Wonderful stuff. But we have to now turn to a rather more darker topic. And I'm going to talk about conspiracy theories, and Julie will speak about the shape of the far right and the fascist movement and the response of anti-fascists to that. I suppose, you know, all of us have recognised that there has been this growth, a spread, an increased visibility of conspiracy theories. Perhaps the most visible side of this is on the anti-lockdown protests. There was one in London of a few hundred yesterday, a couple of hundred in Liverpool last week. These have been rolling on through the autumn, and they're infused by conspiracy theories. But I think it goes way beyond the people on the streets. I've done a number of talks about conspiracy theories in the far right for Socialist Workers Party branches, for example. And one of the most striking features, and in individual conversations with other socialists and so on, is how many people say that someone in their family, someone, a friend, someone at work, even in some cases people who are trade union reps, maybe not necessarily express the hardcore of the conspiracy, but some of the sort of softer elements around those conspiracy theories, which can obviously then become a bridge to the harder core of those ideas. This is quite widespread. So we'll all have heard the arguments that suggest that the COVID pandemic is either a plandemic, deliberately created in a lab, or the product of, perhaps unintentionally, of the 5G phone technology, or somewhat contradictorily, is a fake. It doesn't really exist. It's being exaggerated. It's an excuse for the state to restrict our freedoms. This is the kind of argument you hear on these protests. We'll know the kind of heard the kind of arguments expressed by what are sometimes called anti-vaxxers, which can stretch from people who are skeptical about vaccines to the kind of hardcore opposition to all vaccines per se. And then even further, the kind of argument, I mean, it's a particular demonization of Bill Gates of Microsoft, who is funding research into vaccines, and then the argument is that that his aim is to use the vaccines to implant nanotechnology that will track millions, billions of people across the planet for various nefarious purposes. People will have picked up perhaps on the QAnon conspiracy theory, which here is often under the label of Save Our Children, which suggests that there are widespread organized child abuse rings, at the center of which stand Democratic Party politicians, Hillary Clinton is sometimes mentioned, Hollywood liberals. It's usually members of the elite who are identified as having kind of socially liberal ideas, and that they're engaged not just in sexual abuse, but also using the blood of their child victims for supposedly life-enhancing drugs. I think that is a theory that has clear echoes and parallels with the kind of classic anti-Semitic blood libel that circulated, particularly at the beginning of the 20th century, in places like Germany and in Britain and so on, where there's notion that Jews were seizing Christian children to drink their blood into religious rituals, and often the QAnon theories talk about satanic rituals at the heart of these things. These are widespread ideas. People may have seen that there was a quite widespread reporting of, you might have seen the images of Rudy Giuliani, Trump's lawyer, who was ranting about the supposedly rigged election, and his hair dye was coming down the side of his face. What I thought was shocking is, I heard on Radio 4 them talking about this, but if you actually listen to what Giuliani was saying, he was talking about that the American election had been rigged, complete lie, of course, through a combination of the regime in Venezuela and the financing of George Soros, the Jewish financier. A classic kind of far-right notion of somehow a unity between the left and Jewish financiers. I mean, this is dog whistle anti-Semitism. So these ideas have had an enormous boost from the Trump presidency, from the COVID pandemic, and so on. But I want to argue that it's more than just COVID. I think COVID has accelerated the spread of these ideas. I think it's increased people's fear, people's anxiety, people's sense of turmoil in society. It's also driven by powerful material forces, the fear that the lockdowns will destroy livelihoods. There's a whole section of small property owners. You think about people who run pubs, run restaurants, run hotels, who see their livelihood being destroyed by COVID, and then they're pulled into the ideas that it's exaggerated or indeed that it's a deliberately created fake. But I want to suggest that I think that it has deeper roots. And I think that what it's really driven by is what I'm going to call a crisis of liberal capitalism, and how this is leading to a deep distrust of the institutions and elites of liberal capitalist society. So what I think is going on here is that what liberal capitalism's kind of promise, its claim, is that somehow in society there is a kind of shared mutual interest, despite the evident differences between of wealth in society, that there is a kind of social contract at the heart of society, and institutions like Parliament and more generally the state both express and enforce this social contract. And in the decades that followed the Second World War, the post-war boom of full employment, expanding welfare states, rising intergenerational living standards, each generation will be better off, certainly better off than the generations in the 1930s amongst working class people, the golden age of capitalism. Such ideas could seem to have some purchase. This is long gone. It's broken down as we see the intense pressure on particularly working class people, the spiraling inequalities. Even the middle classes feel like their escalation into the possibility of rising into the rich as the rich, head off into the stratosphere of spectacular wealth. There's a much deeper sense of crisis over society that's built up over the last 3-4 decades. And that's created a crisis of legitimacy in liberal capitalism. So just to give an example, I mean, there's an annual survey by something called the Edelman Trust that has what it calls its barometer of trust, which measures trust in institutions right across the globe. And every year it records how this is declining internationally in country after country. But this year's, the 2020 report, has a particular little chapter about Britain, which it calls a parable of distrust, where it says that Britain now has its lowest ever recording of general trust in its institutions, only one place off the bottom, with only Russia below it. And the trust levels of the British population in their institutions of British society hovers at about 42%. So there's this complete crisis of faith in institutions, in elites, in what's going on in society. And one response to how do you explain this gap between the kind of reality of society and this kind of promise of a social contract and defense of common interests in society is to say that somehow a malevolent small group has come along and corrupted things and poisoned the well for the rest of us. And if we could just remove this small corrupt group, we could restore a harmonious social order and everyone would get their just rewards. And if you think about someone like Trump, often around Trump and his supporters is the idea that, you know, everything was wonderful in the 1950s. If we can only just deal with these conspiracies and these people who corrupt our society, we can restore that kind of golden age. Now, of course, how a small group could somehow come along and corrupt all of society is entirely mysterious, which is often a feature of conspiracy theories. How these small group of people who all seem to be in on it, who seem to control everything in conspiracy theories, have achieved this power is very mysterious, which is often why it blends into sort of occult theories. And it leads to an elitism that somehow we're all stupid and we've allowed this to happen. Conspiracy theories are often full of the idea that we're all sheeple, who've been, you know, have the wool pulled over our eyes. Secondly, that notion that there was once a harmonious social order of common interest and a social contract very easily feeds into ideas of nationalism. Nationalism, of course, has that idea that whether you're rich or poor, if you're British or French or et cetera, you all have something in common. And so for conspiracy theories, it's small steps that only need to be taken to the idea that the small group that's corrupted society are outsiders, aliens to the nation, which can both target racial minorities and open the door to racism, but also to classic anti-Semitism, the notion that there is this small group of people who are identified with international footloose finance, the far-right rhetoric about globalism, global elites identified with people like George Soros. It opens the door to an anti-Semitic worldview. And therefore, I think there are people who hold softer versions of these ideas, and I think the far right is part of these protests, but not necessarily the dominant driving force. But it's possible to see how, if those ideas are hardened up, they can become a real boost to the far right, and it's an aspect of the danger that they represent. How do we respond in my last 3 minutes? First of all, I think the kind of liberal response to conspiracy theories, which I basically think is either explicitly or implicitly basically says people are stupid and really they should just trust the institutions and people who run our society, is an utter disaster. A pro-establishment view will not undermine the hold of these ideas, which are precisely an anger at the failure of neoliberal capitalist society to deliver for the mass of society. I think a socialist response has to involve a number of elements. Firstly, I think we actually start from saying society is failing. People are right to be angry. Big Pharma does put profits ahead of the interests of ordinary people. Think about the huge scandal of contaminated blood that happened in the 1980s, where untested blood products were given to people and caused immense damage because, again, profits. Politicians do lie. A Labour British Prime Minister, Tony Blair, told immense lies about the existence of weapons of mass destruction in order to justify a murderous war. We have to identify with that anger, but a Marxist explanation starts from a very different place. There never was a harmonious social order. Our society has always been driven by class, and it's a class society based on profits, and that leads to boom of the post-war era and then crisis. It's the nature of the capitalist system, not some external alien force that explains why society feels like it's falling apart. And it has much deeper roots than simply a few malevolent individuals who all know each other, who have great it has roots in exploitation of the vast majority of society because we don't control the means of creating wealth. But the flip side of that means that we do create the wealth of society, and therefore we have immense potential collective power to stop the flow of profits, to organize and to create a different society. Far from the kind of powerlessness that a lot of conspiracy theories have, we think ordinary people have the power to collectively change things. Therefore, we have to argue patiently but firmly with the people in our families and our workplaces and so on who are influenced by these ideas. And by the way, say to them, don't march with the Nazis who are turning up to these demonstrations, and try and drive a wedge between the softer and the harder core. And lastly, we have to offer not just different arguments, we have to point to and fight for a much bigger fight back that addresses the pay freeze, the jobs crisis, the crisis in the NHS, and offers an alternative based on hope that can transform society and not leave people to the siren call of those who offer a kind of fake anti-establishment that ultimately rests on racism and indeed anti-Semitism. And therefore, socialists have to offer hope that can pull people away from the despair and offer a real explanation and a real possibility of fundamental social change. Thanks, Hannah.
Thanks very much, Mark. Spot on 15 minutes as well, actually to the point, so well done. What a great way to start the session. Again, there's a link to an article by Mark in the chat, so make sure you have a look at that. And keep in your head any questions or comments you might have for the discussion. Our second and final speaker today is Julie Sherry. Julie is a national organizer of Stand Up to Racism. If you are unaware of the work that Stand Up to Racism are doing at the moment, then please go onto the website to have a look. So again, we'll have a kind of 12-15 minute discussion from Julie before bringing it back. So when you're ready, Julie.
Thanks everybody, and hopefully we can have a really good discussion, because I think this is a meeting that's a very important topic, where I think, you know, people are really chewing over what exactly it is that's going on in front of us at the moment. And I think when you look at 2020, really, it's been a completely cataclysmic year, as people have had crisis, deadly pandemic, climate chaos, and the feeling of, you know, imminent ecological disaster. And we're also on the precipice of a looming economic crisis. And, you know, I won't go through this because this will be covered at other meetings, but really it's a year where I think the events, whether it's the pandemic itself or the explosion of the Black Lives Matter movement or the volatility of the US elections, it really reflects an acceleration of this deep process of polarization that has flown out of the crisis of the system, really going back to, you know, the big crash, you know, in 2008. And this is something that, you know, the Socialist Workers Party and our sister organisations in different parts of the world have really pointed to in the, you know, in the last 5 years, is this process that's taken place. The collapse of centre mainstream politics that Mark touched on, you know, that has been dominant for so long, no longer been able to hold sway. And as a result, you're seeing a polarisation on both sides. So we've seen the rise of left movements, but we've also seen the rise of far right movements, fascism, you know, and a shift really quite significant, I think, in the global political picture, particularly in the US and across Europe, of racist populism shifting into the reins of the establishment. So of course Trump is, you know, is the clearest example of this, that kind of sums it up. You know, we have that saying, he's the number one racist and so on, because he captures something about this process and the role that he's played. So, you know, I think if you go back to the beginning of the, you know, the economic crisis in 2008, and this relates to the recent victory in Greece as well, as our experiences in Britain, we did see responses from fascists, from far right, you know, from racist populist elements that were trying to assert themselves as a response to the situation. And as the crisis has deepened, this kind of, you know, line that there had been, this kind of cordon sanitaire, has been broken in mainstream politics. And now we're in a situation where, you know, we've got Trump, or thankfully we don't anymore, but we've had 4 years of Trump's presidency. We've seen a shift of, you know, far right into parliaments across Europe. We've seen, you know, fascists within that. For example, inside the AfD in Germany and in France, you've seen the role of an attempt by fascists in the far right to really shift themselves into having forms of political representation. And so this is something that I think the intensification of the crisis and the not just what the far right has been doing, but what the establishment has been doing as well. So if you look at things like the hostile environment, the real ratcheting up of establishment racism, Johnson's cabinet represents a quite significant shift in terms of what a Tory party in government would actually do. If you look at the things that Johnson himself has said, describing Muslim women wearing the niqab as letterboxes and so on, there's a whole list that people can go through about the shifts, what Priti Patel is up to, trying to talk about setting up offshore detention centres. They're really ratcheting up that, and that is opening up a growing space for the far right. I mean, you look at Trump from what he said about Charlottesville, the attack on Antifa, the defence of the Proud Boys, all in the build up to the election, the fact that there are militias that he's happy to sort of encourage to exist. He is at part of that driving process of trying to of giving huge space to really dangerous far right and fascist forces. And as Mark mentioned, the Giuliani example, everybody was focused on the hair dye, but actually what he was saying was a very particular political message, to those people. So this is quite a worrying situation. Sorry about that. If we were to take a score sheet of what's happened in the far right movement across Europe in recent years, I think that you can see that there are groups that have managed to advance and there are some that have gone backwards, but whatever the case is, the space available for them to grow is growing. So whether it's the kind of right-wing authoritarian populism that we see in Viktor Orban's Hungary, or in Poland, where we see that not only racism but also like a quite conservative kind of bigotry towards LGBT communities, misogyny and so on. I mean, obviously we've seen the response in Poland recently of the women's marches and so on. These are consistently articulated planks of the far right's agenda there. You look at France, the last general election, Le Pen's national rally, which emerged out of the Front National, took 33.9% of the vote. But there's an interesting process going on in France, because you also have this opposition of a new burgeoning movement around the sans-papiers against police violence. And then you have a situation where Macron's role now in whipping up absolutely rampant Islamophobia, driving an onslaught on Muslims from the state, is a situation that, in a country where the left in general has failed to really take up an opposition to Islamophobia as a form of racism. It's an incredibly dangerous situation, and you can see that it's provoking all kinds of responses, and really a clear example of how Islamophobia is this kind of thin end of the wedge in driving through racism as a response to the crisis. In Italy, again in the 2018 election, the racist populist Five Star Party won 31% of the vote and entered government. And you can see, this is a reflection really of trends across Europe, where governments are deeply embedded in crisis, and where the far right are still presenting themselves as an alternative to the failure of the mainstream politics. If we jump over to Britain, I think it's something that we should be proud of in the movement, and that the far right are actually relatively weak, like pitifully weak in terms of organisation here. There have been various rising waves that which has been defeated by an organised mass movement as a method to defeat them. So you look at the onset of the crisis, we saw the English Defence League, and of course the much more pitiful Scottish Defence League up here, and we saw that was a threat that had to be taken on. So it's not that we've managed to have a movement here, an anti-racist movement, an anti-fascist movement in Britain that has defeated each rising attempt of the far right or of the fascists to try and gain foothold. So the EDL were knocked back, but that was after a series of a couple of years of having to mobilise really seriously and trying to outnumber them and trying to mobilise the mass movement. Similarly, it's 10 years on since the BNP were defeated in Barking. It was a similar process, and of course you know, the question of Tommy Robinson in 2018 trying to, you know, as a fascist, you know, Stephen Yaxley Lennon, trying to assemble a movement behind him, particularly focusing on football grounds, street mobilisations, and so on. And we saw, you know, 15,000 far right marching behind Tommy Robinson in the streets in the summer of 2018. But, you know, again, it was that method of having a mass movement that you reached out to people who were socialists, who were revolutionaries, who were people who were in the Labour Party, who were people in, you know, all different political parties and organisations, councillors, politicians, crucially the trade unions, mobilising that social weight of the organised working class across different faith groups, making sure that we were clear that we were going to oppose every single instance of racism, Islamophobia and anti-Semitism, and that we were going to stand together to do it. And you know, this was you know, through you know, a year or so of mobilisations, both nationally, also in localities where they tried to mobilise, and also crucially in the European elections where Robinson wanted to be he wanted to win the seat in the Northwest. This was these are really crucial campaigns that people should read up in Socialist Worker and look at Stand Up to Racism's website to get more of the detail of it. So we, and this obviously stands as well in a tradition of the Anti-Nazi League. People have probably seen the film White Riot, which was on television recently. You can look it up as well. It's very worth watching about the Anti-Nazi League. This is a tradition, a tried and tested method of mass mobilisation to oppose them, and this is a method that works. And so I think the situation that we're in now, I'm sorry, Hannah, could you give me an indication of how much time I've left?
Yeah, sure. You're just about 10 minutes in, so you've got up to 10 minutes.
Great. So yeah, I think that, you know, this is the backdrop where we have had a successful method of being able to drive back the right, but the threat is still continuing to come at us because of the scale of the crisis. So you know, obviously Mark talked about the anti-lockdown mobilisations, you know, the fact that we saw thousands in Trafalgar Square, that this is a reflection of a growing movement, that obviously they're very contradictory and confused mobilisations, and it would be a misunderstanding to describe everybody at all as even far right, you know, or racist, never mind fascist, who's turning up on these mobilisations. And Mark explained that in more detail about how conspiracy theories can become attractive to people in situations where you know, there's this very understandable complete lack of trust in the establishment figures. But, you know, at the same time, there have been Holocaust deniers such as David Icke. There's been fascists operating unchallenged within these demonstrations. And the rightward trajectory, I think, of it is quite clear, unless there's an intervention of a kind of organised collective response of the left. And I think that, you know, also Mark touched upon this as well about, you know, elements of the class nature of these demonstrations, that of course the pandemic is not only hammering working class people, but if you're, you know, a small business owner, or, you know, if you're you know, yeah, somebody who's sort of running a business that's been thrown into chaos from the crisis, but you're not really rooted in the kind of trade unions or the working class movement where you would look to a collective response to you know, better your situation or stop the onslaught, or, you know, stop yourself from facing these attacks. You can see how people are drawn to these kind of libertarian notions of freedom, and you know, it's a more individualistic response really. And I think historically, in moments of deep crisis, this kind of group plays quite a contradictory role and can be pulled by their class interest towards rightward movements, but they can also be pulled into left movements. And so I think there's a huge onus in relation to the anti-lockdown, anti-mask movement on the left to really direct the anger and provide a strategy. And you know, that's about challenging what's going on in the pandemic. That's about providing an alternative. That's about defending workers' rights within that process. But it's also about the anti-racist movement, you know, building really strong currents that can ward against the pull of that kind of rightward, individualistic orientated response. So I think that that's a big challenge that we face. I mean, if you look at the anti-lockdown movement in Germany, it demonstrates the ability of these groups to really morph into something much more dangerous, and reflected similar forces to what we saw in Britain, but in Germany the difference is that some of the Nazis were core organisers. The Alternative for Deutschland, the AfD, have played a significant, have managed to have significant political representation in Parliament, and the NPD, the fascists still have a level of organisation in East Germany. So you can see how if these forces are more organised, or if they're allowed to be given any space to get more organised, these contradictory mobilisations can, there's a battle for ideas going on, and there's a battle between that pull towards the right and what the left can do to pull things in the opposite direction. And a big part of, a big part of what makes us stronger to be able to respond to that is having the united front approach to opposing racism, but particularly opposing the fascists. And obviously people will know about the victory in Greece, Golden Dawn, fascist kind of one of the most kind of overtly kind of street mobilization style fascist organizations that we really have an example of at the moment. And it was a long time coming, going back to the 90s, where there was an attempt by the fascist Golden Dawn to there was an increase in the number of attacks. That they were on trial, and this particular trial lasted 5.5 years. And when the verdict came back and Golden Dawn were defeated, and a whole swathe of them are going to jail, it was a massive victory for the anti-fascist and anti-racist movement internationally. And it was a reflection of that there were 50,000 people on the streets outside the court on a mass anti-racist demonstration celebrating the victory. This is the kind of movement that can be successful. So it wasn't just the case of although the lawyers are wonderful and they're part of the anti-fascist movement, but it wasn't just the case of, being tried in the court, and that it was the courts that somehow did this. I mean, the right party and the Tory party essentially in Greece tried to come out and say that they were against Golden Dawn, they were an anti-fascist party, but actually this was a huge shift for them to have to say that, because going back to the 1970s in Greece and so on, there's always been this kind of comfortable space where these forces haven't really been challenged and have been allowed to operate. So that's a huge shift inside Greek society, and it's a huge shift internationally, and it really underlines that lesson that where you reach out to broad forces, where you mobilize a mass campaign that links trade unions, that goes into workplaces and raises anti-racist politics there, and brings people into organizations, demonstrations, that links up the different sort of faith groups and so on across society, that puts pressure on politicians to be part of this movement. You minimize the space for them, and you're able to defeat them. And similarly, in Austria, and I'll sum up on this kind of point. In Austria, the fantastic work by our comrades over in Austria and the Mass Anti-Racist United Front campaign, which is a sister organisation of Stand Up to Racism and a sister organisation of Kirfa in Greece, which is the Mass Anti-Racist and Anti-Fascist campaign there, have been out on the streets. They've mobilised in big numbers, and after a few years, the FBO, the Freedom Party, have just been have just lost 23% of their share of the vote in the Austrian elections. So again, it's another example. And I think that for us, obviously Marxism is hosted by the Socialist Workers Party. The Socialist Workers Party stands in a long, proud tradition that you would have seen reflected in the White Riot film, and people should watch that if they haven't seen it, of organising these mass campaigns to expose fascists, organising mass campaigns that are taking on the far right's attempt to organise, that take seriously the need to mobilise every single time and never be complacent about this. And I think that in Greece, in Austria, and in Britain with the defeat of Tommy Robinson recently, this method that has been fought for by revolutionaries, but fought for by mass campaigns that bring together lots of different political forces, such as Stand Up to Racism or such as Unite Against Fascism. This is, we have a method that works here, and we have to fight very, very hard to continue to use that tool of building these mass campaigns that reach out into society and challenge the threat posed. Because the threat, when we look at the system just now, the conditions that are being created by the crisis, by the pandemic, we're obviously going to continue to face this problem, and we need to make sure that we mobilise to stop every single instance of this threat rising.
Thanks very much. Sorry, it's really not a fun job to interrupt someone when they're mid-flow and raising so many important points, but we have to be able to open the floor up for a discussion with everyone and hopefully get everyone contributing. Two very, very powerful and thought-provoking introductions to the topic there. I think we've really ticked every box for covering the themes in the session: conspiracy theories, far-right and authoritarianism. So I now open up the discussion. If you would like to contribute, you can navigate to the bottom of the screen, of the Zoom screen. You'll see the participants button. If you click on the button, you'll raise your hand and you'll be brought into the discussion. I'll try and give some indication of the order or when you'll be brought in. But if I don't, you won't be missed. We will get to you. There might be a slight delay between me saying you're going to be brought in and then your mic being unmuted. So just bear with us. Please keep contributions to a maximum of 3 minutes. If it looks like you're going to go beyond 3 minutes, I'll interrupt you and ask you to summarize as well. So first hand we've got there is Penny. If we could bring in Penny, please, to contribute.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you, Penny.
Sorry, I lost my tile. Yeah, I just got a question. I put it in chat, so apologies if you've already read this, you'll be bored. But it was more to do with some of the issues that Mark raised, actually, that COVID raises so many different complex issues that the People Before Profit program really, presents us with a fantastic opportunity, which, hopefully people have been punting that in the trade unions and the rest of it. It's a package of measures that working class people need and fight for. And I saw yesterday Julie put out a call from Stand Up to Racism call for support for zero COVID. And I think many workers find that as a really daunting prospect. It's not possible without financial support. The government has turned down any kind of upgrading of universal benefit, and furlough schemes have been really inadequate, etc. So, is zero COVID an abstract propagandist call that would just feed into the kind of attractions that some of the conspiracy theorists have, freedom, and liberty and all the rest of it? So that's my question. Sorry.
Thanks, Penny. Yep, just to remind everyone as well, in the chat box, you can write questions or comments in there as well if you'd rather them being read out. Although it's good to speak up if you feel like it. So our next contributor will be Bob. If we could bring in Bob, please.
Yeah, I think that's me. Yeah, hi everybody. Yeah, I really just want to make 2 points in the few minutes I've got. First one is that I think we've got to recognise that the ruling class engage in conspiracies, and that's the first point. I mean, a couple of examples, I think, just now. I mean, Mark mentioned some examples, but obviously Tony Blair's one of it kind of lies about the Iraq War. But a couple of examples. One was Edward Snowden, who was the kind of CIA operative that blew the lid on a kind of CIA's global surveillance program. Actually surveilling people on the internet and using different means to actually listen into people's conversations and read their emails, etc. He's actually currently living in Russia because he's potentially under arrest if he goes back to America. So that was something that they tried to keep hidden from us, the fact that this was going on. So that was the first one. The second one I wanted to mention was, people have seen in the last couple of days that a top Iranian nuclear scientist was shot in Iran. Now, And there's no evidence, but I mean, it's almost certainly some form of Western state involvement, potentially the Israeli state, almost certainly the American state. And so that is an example, I think, of where the ruling class have involved in a conspiracy, which they want to hide from us. So that's the first point. So, I mean, we live in a society in which, you know, that sort of thing happens, and we can understand it. We can understand it on the basis of the need for the ruling class to maintain their power and imperialism and state power, etc. So I think that's the first point. I think the second point is that I think we've got to reject conspiracy theories, and I think there's two reasons for that. I mean, one, I think it's been highlighted. This is not a new thing where conspiracy theories actually benefit the far right, and I think we on the left have got to be really, really sceptical about actually getting involved in them. And I remember when I was involved in the Scottish Socialist Party in the early 2000s, they actually reprinted the argument about the anti-vax argument by Andrew Wakefield. You know, they actually in Scottish Socialist Voice, and I remember at the time feeling quite uneasy about it. I mean, that time there was a kind of idea that there's a link between vaccinations and autism, but I think we've got to be really, really sceptical. And I think the other reason why I think we've got to be skeptical, is because, just quickly, is because we've actually got the tools, I think, ourselves in terms of Marxism, our understanding of class society, our understanding of the state, and our understanding of how things work, that we don't need to get involved in conspiracy theories. There's plenty of evidence, I think, of how the ruling class operates, and we've got to use the concrete evidence, I think, to undermine them, rather than get involved in wild ideas which eventually end up benefiting the very ruling class and ruling elite, which we're trying to undermine and fight. Thanks.
Thanks very much. Before I bring in Charlie, there's a comment that's been put into the chat by Zanira, which I think is worth reading out, some insightful points. There has been a rise in the far-right governments all over the world, such as in India, Israel, Brazil, Greece, Norway, America, and the UK, and many more. However, I am glad to see the rise in anti-fascists and the rise of Black Lives Matter movement. Part of the reason why so many far-right individuals are in positions of power is due to the fact that capitalism benefits directly from racism. So thank you for adding that. Now bring in Charlie, please.
Right, cheers, thanks, yeah. The actual threat of the far right is still very real, both in the UK and in Europe. And over the years, anti-fascists have fought them back successfully in most cases. And it is still a threat in the USA as well, in spite of Trump's defeat. And I won't forgive him for saying something like, both sides were as bad as each other, following the fascist murder of Heather Heyer in 2017. Now, in the UK, we've beaten back both the BNP and the EDL, who garnered a lot of support at the beginning of their street campaign, and we fought them back, and they're nothing now, so to speak. You know, now in 1930s Germany, the so-called conspiracy theories that was propagated was swallowed up by some people by propagating anti-Semitism as such, and that type of talk led to the biggest mass murder in history in Nazi concentration camps. Now that thing must never be repeated again. And of course, when we say never again, we actually mean that never again. And we must never let our guard down, and never let any fascists or racists off the hook in any shape or form whatsoever. We'll keep fighting them back for a better society and all that thing. Cheers, thank you, I'm done. Thanks.
Thanks, Charlie. Now bring in Henry, please.
Hi, you hear me, Hannah? Yeah?
Yep, can hear you perfectly.
Thanks. I think I just put my hand up there following Charlie's point, which I think is really pertinent, because whilst we have managed in this country to beat back a fascist organisation really from the 1930s onwards, in pre-Nazi Germany, the left, which was far stronger than probably any other left parties that have been in the world outside outside Russia at the time, were incapable of beating back the Nazis, partly because they were incapable of working together. They both thought that each other were more dangerous than the Nazis, and even although in the last democratic election in Germany in November 1932, the communists and the socialists together got more votes than the Nazis got, their inability to work together was a key factor in the Nazis being able to come together and doing the kind of atrocities that Charlie talked about. So I think the lesson today for us is very real. It's come down to us, and I think what Julie talked about in the United Front, that we need to build as big as possible an organization of people who may not agree with each other on everything, but do agree that we need to stop the Nazis, that we need to try and oppose racism. I think, as Marx said at the beginning, this organization needs to try and drive a wedge between the hardline Nazis and those people who are a bit worried about vaccines, who are a bit worried about mask wearing, who are a bit worried about government activities. We just mustn't write them off and say on you go. And that needs what was talked about at the time in the 1930s as United Front, but never put into operation, was put into operation, funnily enough, in Britain in the 1930s against the British Union of Fascists, after the Nazis had come to power, that we used in the 1970s and 80s against the National Front, and we used in the 1990s and 2000s and later against the BNP and the EDL. That needs to be our way of working to stop the Nazis, that we unite in what we agree about, whilst at the same time we can argue about what we disagree about. Thanks, Hannah.
Thanks very much. Completely agree with you there. While there's no hands up, actually, I'd quite like to ask a question or raise a point as well in relation to these themes that have come out today. Predominantly being, and I think this is probably more directed towards Mark because of the emphasis on conspiracy theories, but there seems to be an assumption that because of there now being a virtual online world, that there's something fundamentally different about QAnon or conspiracies, that there's no linearity between what we've seen previously. And I think to an extent, this is a bit of a false assumption. Humans are humans. And I think it was right pointing out the connection between the anti-Semitism of the kind of cabal and bloodletting. I mean, following the Black Death, there was similar scapegoating of Jews, and it was a conspiracy theory very much in the similar vein. And so our attention is taken away from the racist ideas and ideology within this, if we focus too much on it being something that's specifically online or different. So if you could talk a little bit about how you think being online kind of interacts with our fight against these kind of ideas, that would be really great. Got a message in the chat as well from Keith Pender saying he'd like to speak. So if we could open up the floor to Keith, that would be fantastic.
Thanks. Just to go back to Mark's point about, I think it's a really relevant point about how these people who are attracted by conspiracy theories, how they are, aggrieved and frustrated at the society living in, a lot of them at the crisis of the system and lack of legitimacy in the institutions. And it's a real dangerous moment because we know that people can get pulled in a far right direction. And even though a lot of these demonstrations that we've seen, they're not sort of explicitly far right demonstrations, but there is that sort of fine line, with seeing like George Soros has been a great influence, or before that, it was the Rothschilds are still mentioned. It's still these far right anti-Semitic tropes, and it's often helped with so-called mainstream politicians as well, not just in Britain but across Europe. People like Viktor Orban has accused George Soros of wanting to, I think he uses the words flood Europe with refugees. So it's the kind of great replacement theory that's come up in recent years with all of these far right terrorists have popularised it, and that has been given credence at almost mainstream political level, which is very dangerous, really. And a lot of the sort of the people who attend these demonstrations, you could say they are a kind of usual constituency of the far right, the small business owner, shopkeeper type, as well as being some working class people there. But I think a lot of the people who are attracted by them, if we were at a greater level of class struggle, I think things could be different. People could be attracted by genuine anti-establishment and anti-capitalist ideas, and people who are really seeking to challenge the system. And it could take them away from being attracted to these groups and these backward ideas. Because we've just seen last couple of years, Corbynism has been on the rise and gave people a lot of confidence to thinking that they could change the system through Parliament. That was defeated, and Tories got a massive majority. That would have a really that's been a setback, and would be real frustrating for people. So I think it's what we're seeing is it's a dangerous moment, but I think we can be hopeful that when we get to if we're getting to a stage of more of a sustained fight back, then not when we're challenging the system and the dominant ideas and and the austerity that we know is going to come with the fallout from COVID, then I think all of those people who are attracted by at the moment by these sort of libertarian type ideas, I think they're still winnable. So I think we can't sort of dismiss them as just being all far right, at these demonstrations. I think a lot of these people, they can be peeled away from those who are more sort of fascist elements who are trying to sort of take them in that direction.
Thanks very much, Keith. Can we now bring in Kev, and then after that we'll have Richard.
Hi, it's actually me, Kev's partner, Poppy.
Sorry.
Sorry, no, it says Kev, so that's understandable. But yeah, I just wanted to bring up the point, kind of touching on, was it Henry? Yeah, what he was saying about creating a united front, and how we should probably be careful of how we use the term conspiracy theorists and labeling people as conspiracy theorists, and how this could potentially draw a wedge between people that actually are on the same side, and to be careful not to group people who might question some aspects of society, such as, like Bob said, vaccines, and group them together with sort of far right Holocaust deniers, all under the same term of conspiracy theorists, because that could potentially drive people away or scare people off from joining the cause and creating a united front. Just from first-hand experience, we've just had a baby, and we never expected to be against any of the vaccines. We planned to get all of them, but obviously we felt it's every parent's prerogative to make an informed decision, so do our own research, and we did lots of our own research, and we realized that some of the vaccines just aren't necessary. For example, the hepatitis B, which is a sexually transmitted disease, it can only be transferred through sexual intercourse. So unless the mother has it, then there's no way the child's going to get it. And my doctor agreed that there's absolutely no reason why children should be injected with this vaccine. But if you mention it to anyone, if you try and question the doctors, or you try and open a discussion about it, you instantly get labeled as a conspiracy theorist. And I think this is a really it's not a productive way forward, and it can actually sort of create more divisions when, like Henry mentioned, we should be trying more to to have a healthy, open discussion and really delve into these issues that people are raising and separate the people who genuinely are fascists or have these really dangerous ideas from people who are questioning, quite rightly, things like vaccines for, you know, the sake of their children, or any other aspect of society in which conspiracy theories could sort of seep in, and people could be, you know, tarnished with that same brush. So yeah, I just wanted to raise that point, and of mainly how we think about the term conspiracy theorist and who exactly does that involve, and it's such a broad term. So yeah, that's all I'm going to say. So
Thanks very much. If we could move on to Richard now, that would be great.
Hey, yeah, I just actually wanted to come back on a little bit on what Hannah had said about the internet, because I think that, you know, this is one of the main ways in which people are understanding the popularity of conspiracy theories at the moment. The fact that the internet has come along, social media has come along, and these ideas can circulate more easily. And I do think that there's some truth to this idea, but it's also a historical idea, because, you know, if you think about the 1920s and the 1930s, there was similar phenomenon of, you know, the mass popularity of certain conspiracy theories, and obviously the most infamous of those are the anti-Semitic conspiracy theories of the fascists and the Nazis and so on, which gained so much credence at the time. And I think that this is an important point, actually, because it informs the way in which the liberal centre is responding to conspiracy theories. One of the main ways in which they've tried to respond to conspiracy theories in 2020, apart from just, you know, ridiculing people and calling them stupid and so on, is to try to ban them from social media platforms. So you see QAnon groups being banned from Facebook, including pages which are against QAnon. So, but also, you know, people like the infamous conspiracy theorist David Icke being banned from YouTube, and these sort of tags that you get on Twitter now, which are you know, referring people to government websites if they're spreading misinformation, so-called, about the vaccine and so on. And I think that there's two big problems with this response, really. The first is that there's no reason that this can't be turned against the left. We know that people get thrown off of social media platforms for supporting Palestine and so on and so forth. This is obviously a danger. But the second and bigger problem is that actually it does nothing to fix this crisis of legitimacy, which Mark talked about in his opening. The truth is that there is this huge crisis, that the central institutions of capitalist society, the politicians, the media, the so-called experts, have all been involved over the past 30 years in driving through these neoliberal reforms which have impoverished ordinary people. And this is generating this deep crisis of distrust. People no longer trust these institutions. And that crisis is really, really fucking deep right now. I mean, a survey from America last week, I think, said that 68% of people who voted for Donald Trump at the election at the beginning of November believed that the election was rigged, right? So 49 million people, roughly, in the United States are bringing into question this central institution of bourgeois democracy, the secret ballot. And I think that, you know, one thing that we have to say as socialists about this is actually, like, we don't have any interest in trying to rebuild trust in the institutions of capitalism and the institutions of the liberal centre. We actually have to build something completely different, new institutions in which ordinary people can actually democratically participate and therefore can trust those institutions.
Thank you very much indeed for that. Answered some of my questions, so I went into it, so appreciated. Just want to point out that it's been great so far how this conversation discussion has been very respectful and very nuanced. Really enjoyed that, to see that. A couple of comments in the chat that are worth highlighting as well. Kind of Zanira's pointed out about the ongoing genocides, and that's kind of encourage people to discuss that a bit further in the chat. I am now going to bring Stephen back in, if that's okay.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, I'm kind of been sort of morbidly fascinated by how these conspiracies are really gaining hold with a lot of people. There's a lot of people. I've had a few conversations with people, I guess, kind of in my extended family, about some things about COVID not being as bad as the flu and that kind of thing, and the best response is to explain patiently, because a lot of these people they're not sort of card carrying people, cult members or anything. I think there's a mixed consciousness going on, because I remember having a conversation with someone who saw themselves as left wing and had shared many left wing ideas, but also had bought into some of the conspiracy theories to a certain extent. And it was a wee, in a conversation, I felt like I'd kind of brought them over to the right side, if you know what I mean. So it's not kind of all despair, although left hysteria, anti-left hysteria is a huge part of what drives these conspiracies, terms like New World Order and things like that, which is basically far right code for communism. So I think being understanding, having kind of compassion instead of kind of taking the liberal tactic of just calling people stupid is a road to nowhere is the best way. You explain patiently, as Lenin said, up to a point, obviously. But it depends on how much the person's you're talking to is kind of bought into the dream, because it is a lot of these conspiracies are kind of dreamlike when you think about it. They're sort of outside of reality. It's a bit of a refuge for people. I think sometimes if people who are kind of despairing of the world and they're not really seeing any kind of hope, it's kind of easy to fall into that kind of pattern of despair. But despair is a driver of fascism. Fascism uses despair. I think so. It's important to understand as well ourselves these conspiracies. We've got to kind of have a look and see where they're coming from and what they really mean. So we're better equipped to fight them. Cheers.
Thanks very much. There are no more hands raised at the moment, so I think this is probably a good time to wind down the discussion and bring the speakers back in to summarise. Before I do so, just a couple of things to highlight and point out. As with the other sessions throughout this weekend, there is a hub, which is a virtual social room. Today that will be you can access that between 3 and 4 p.m. If you look on the programme, there's a link, you just click on it from there. It's a great place to continue discussion and to meet people, to have a general chat. I will be there today between 3 and 4. So if anyone would like to talk to me about joining the Socialist Workers Party or going to any Socialist Worker Party branch meetings, or just to say hi and have a chat, then say hello to me there. The hub is also a place for you to speak to Bookmarks for recommendations on books in relation to this session today, or indeed any socialist material, but we do have 2 specific recommendations for you, which you'll be able to see now. You can also order books from Bookmarks if they don't have them in stock. So it's a great way to show your support for an independent socialist bookshop. So thanks very much for that. To enter the hub, again, you click on the link. So I'd now like to bring back in the 2 speakers to summarise, have about 5 minutes each, if that's okay. Bring in Mark first. And again, Mark, I'll just message you if it looks like you're going to go over 5 minutes, if that's all right.
Great. Thanks, Hannah. And thanks, everyone, for a great meeting. Just reply to a few of the questions. I think the point that Penny raised at the beginning, I think that every time we argue, socialists, for the kind of public health measures that are necessary to contain the pandemic, the most recent lockdown did not go as far as even the lockdown earlier in the year, and we have to argue for non-essential workplaces, an end to face-to-face teaching at universities, rotas and schools as a minimum, etc., etc. But we always have to combine that with arguments about a defence of people's livelihoods. If people are forced to make a choice between their health and their livelihoods, which is essentially what was taking place in the US election, Biden talked a lot about safety measures, but very little about financial support. And Trump talked about financial support, but obviously, you know, he's a COVID skeptic. This polarization is a disaster. And we have to combine the two. And Penny's right, the People Before Profit Emergency Programme is one attempt to do that by raising essentially anti-capitalist demands that say that working class people shouldn't pay for the crisis that's erupting around us. I think that's a very important point. Secondly, I think Hannah is absolutely right to stress, because I think there's a lot of this, and I think it's too superficial to just somehow blame the internet for conspiracy theories. Obviously, technological developments can affect the way that people access it, discuss it, and so on, but this is not the key. Conspiracy theories, anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, most obviously, were, you know, something the Nazis were able to draw on that were quite widespread in parts of German society, and not just German society at the turn of the 20th century. In other words, the problem isn't technology. The problem is a deep crisis of capitalist society and the answers that people turn to and the political options that are available to them. Thirdly, and I'm sorry, this is racing through a few points, but look, I think that it's, you know, I think that what socialists have to say about science and medicine, I think has to be neither simply uncritical celebration of them in our society, nor a denial of the huge advances. I mean, the fact that all of us can expect as an average to live much, much longer than our great-grandparents is a reflection of advances, particularly in science and medicine and so on. At the same time, and we don't have to deny that, and in one sense capitalism has driven that, but because everything is subordinated to profit and capital accumulation, that also undermines and limits, you know, the very fact that the COVID vaccines, which most big pharma was not even interested in doing because they didn't think it's profitable, has relied on colossal inputs or billions of pounds from states who then corner the market at often extravagant costs, which they then shift onto the burden to the rest of us. Everything is about profit. And in other words, it's not science per se, it's the capitalist social relations that we have to attack. And I think we have to grapple with that contradictory nature of science and medicine under capitalism, not deny either side. Zanira's point about genocides, let me just say, I think this is absolutely right. Capitalism was born, as Karl Marx said, dripping in blood and murder. If you think about the murder of indigenous peoples under colonialism, think about what happened to the Native Americans in what's now the United States, the Armenian genocide, right through to the Rwandan genocide. And these horrors are a profound feature of capitalist society. Capitalist society rests on the reality that some people live at other people's expense. We toil so others can live luxurious lives. In a crisis, that can become the idea that the only way that you can survive is through the death of other people. This is the heart of the genocidal idea, and capitalist states are able to drive through the most staggering levels of violence, and that's a feature of capitalism. So there is a continuity. There are continuities between the genocides we see in the 20th century and earlier, and so on and so forth, and the Holocaust. At the same time, there is something unique about the Holocaust, which we also have to recognize and insist on, which is that it wasn't just one genocide amongst any, that not just in its scale, but also the fact that it was this systematic, planned, industrialized killing machine represents a new level of horror under capitalist society. And as the comrade said, that we have to insist on never again. Final point, to return to what I started, we face a crisis of liberal capitalism. This is not going to go away just because Biden is elected or there's a vaccine or Keir Starmer's in charge of the Labour Party now. The crises are going to deepen, and that opens the door to both more radical left-wing answers based on collective struggle and solidarity and transformation from below, or reaction right through to fascism that argues you have to throttle some other group, usually a racial group, a minority, in order to survive. And it's a battle between these forces of despair and hope, and therefore that we need both a mass anti-fascist movement, but also a much bigger collective working class struggle and a much bigger socialist alternative. So I hope people consider joining the Socialist Workers Party to be part of that. Thanks, Hannah.
Thanks very much. Agree very much so. Can we bring Julie in for her summary, please?
Hi, thanks everybody for a good discussion. Two things: I've got a good blue tack solution for my phone, so hopefully it's going to stay put. And the music outside is my neighbour, not mine. I'm sorry about that. So I want to sort of finish where Mark left off there, about hope and despair, because I think in this meeting, obviously a lot of what we're discussing is quite worrying developments and spaces that are being opened up as the crisis accelerates. The whole question of the anti-lockdown thing is a new space for the far right to operate within. This is because people's consciousness is being really kind of churned up by everything that they're seeing around them, and that explains a lot the sort of increase in people being drawn to conspiracy theory ideas, or a different thing is about the levels to which the establishment has used racism throughout the crisis, and really ratcheted it up, and that creates more space for the far right to grow. So we've been talking about a lot of things which are quite worrying and quite scary actually in the world. But I think that the flip side of that is that this is not a one-sided situation. Like the Black Lives Matter movement has been absolutely a bit of a watershed moment in a sense. It's completely blown open, and the institutionalized racism at the heart of society. It's opened up for huge swathes of people all around the world. We've seen this here, and the anti-racist movement here has been completely transformed and rejuvenated, and brought whole new layers of people into the anti-racist movement and into thinking about the system, the world around them, what's happening, about questions about slavery, colonialism, and I think between the Black Lives Matter movement and the COVID-19 situation, I mean, the petition that Penny mentioned, that Stand Up to Racism has launched, is actually one which is about the disproportionate Black and ethnic minority deaths due to COVID. This has been completely, really stark situation. And I think that the combination of these things is like everywhere you look, the system is being really exposed as being systematically completely shit for people, putting people's health behind the question of profit in ways that are like so stark at the moment. I think, the whole question of Penny raised the question about zero COVID, and I think Mark covered that, but really the question shouldn't be about having to make a choice between these things, and we have to fight actually for a sensible method and articulate an argument about how the complete murderous mishandling of this crisis it's not this endless situation that we can't do anything about. It's been mishandled because the system doesn't care about people, so I think, but it's a wider point really. Thanks for Penny's comment there, but it's a wider point about the way that people are being just there's a battle for ideas going on, and people's ideas are really being thrown up in the air because all the kind of mantra of the system that they've been told for years has, there's a breaking up of that, and that's why we're seeing this polarization, because the centre can't any longer provide any kind of it can't convince people anymore. So I think that we have to look to those really positive movements. I mean, seeing masses of people having the I remember for example, a few years ago in America, when there was the mass fast food strikes, which was, about 90%, black working class people who took the streets, were part of a very big strike and so on. And when one of them was describing the moment where they decided to walk out together, they talked about it was a moment where they lost their fear. And I think that, in a way, there was an element of that when you watch what's happening around the world right now, in all these places where people are just, fighting back, and we see the explosion of these mass movements, and I think there's enormous hope in that. But I think, to end on this point really, I mean, what we do inside those movements really matters. What the movements do, it mattered that there were socialists at the heart of the fight against Golden Dawn in Greece. It mattered that there was a concerted effort to construct such a campaign that went right into the workplaces, the unions that fought on all these fronts, that put masses of people onto the streets, that strategized about what the best way to win this fight was. Similarly in Austria, where the FPO had a blow. Similarly for us here in Britain, when we had to think about what the bloody hell are we going to do about the fact that there's 15,000 on the streets marching behind a fascist, understanding that wasn't everybody wasn't a fascist, that racism was playing a big role. We, you know, what do? You go and target the football grounds, you mobilise mass support across society, which wasn't easy because people aren't always convinced. A lot of the unions wanted to see Robinson defeated, but we're afraid that, you know, can we safely call our members onto these demos? Oh, and, you know, debates about how big a threat they are. These are constant questions that are thrown up inside movements about what you do to be successful in the movement. And I think that you know, the role that revolutionaries play is about having strategies about how we can fight back, how we can resist the attacks that are being put on us. But it's also about saying, you know, what Richard touched upon about the scale, and Mark, you know, the scale of this crisis, it's not going away. The ruling class of this system have no answers to be able to deal with this polarization and these big ruptures and breaks that are taking place, and this triple crisis that's hitting people. So we need to have a different solution, which is about getting rid of the system. And like people have said, you know, I think one of the things that the COVID crisis has really exposed, the whole question of a key worker. Do you know what I mean? Is suddenly, when we've been told all our lives that it's the rich and powerful, it's people like Richard Branson, or it's people like, you know, Boris Johnson or Theresa May, who run everything and make society run. Suddenly, society can't, you know, the only way that society can deal with its crisis is by supermarket workers, health workers, you know, teachers, and so on. And I think that you know, we have to fight to build a response to the crisis, and we have to fight to make sure that the unions mobilise and fight to mobilise that force of working class power in the situation, and enthuse that resistance with the kind of big political movements that are around and inspiring or horrifying people. But I think that, you know, we have to fight within that to not have the answer ending up being Keir Starmer or Joe Biden, because it's just going to create the same circumstances again. So I think what the Socialist Workers Party is about you know, fighting to get rid of capitalism and organising to do that. And that organisation is absolutely crucial. Without that organisation, you can have ideas, you can know what you think about the situation, you can believe in a revolution, but without actively fighting to build an organisation that can be in every workplace, every movement, linked up internationally around the world, learning from what's happening, then, you know, we're not going to be able to succeed. So that's what the Socialist Workers Party is about. And if you're not a member, I think, you know, please consider joining us. Please talk to us if you want to talk about that more, because we need solutions, and we definitely have an enormous amount of hope in the movements in front of us.